Odysseus was alive. That was the one thing no one in Ithaca could prove, and the one thing Penelope refused to stop believing, even as her own home filled with men who wanted her to give up. Troy had fallen 10 years earlier. The war was over. The ships were meant to sail home, and Odysseus, king of Ithaca, had earned the right to return to his wife, his son, and the small rocky island that made even Troy feel far away. But 10 more years had passed since that victory, and Ithaca had not seen him again. His palace no longer belonged only to his family. More than 100 men from the surrounding islands filled its halls, eating his cattle, drinking his wine, and pressing his wife to choose a new husband, certain that Odysseus was dead. His son, Telemachus, had grown from a child into a young man who was mocked in his own home by guests who had no intention of ever leaving. And somewhere far across the sea, on an island no sailor could find twice, Odysseus sat on a rocky shore, staring at water he was not permitted to cross, kept there by a goddess who loved him and would not let him go. He had survived Troy. He had survived a Cyclops, a god's fury, and the deaths of every man who had sailed beside him. But surviving and returning home were not the same thing. Nothing in 10 years of suffering had promised him that his house, his wife, or his son would still be waiting for him if he ever escaped. How could a man defeat monsters and outlast the sea itself and still lose everything, simply by arriving too late? In the halls of Olympus, the gods turned their attention to his fate. Poseidon, god of the sea, was far away among the Ethiopians receiving sacrifice, and Athena used his absence to press Odysseus's case before Zeus. Zeus agreed that the time had come for Odysseus to return. Hermes would be sent to Calypso's island with the order for his release, while Athena would go to Ithaca herself. She would not simply comfort Telemachus, she would force him to step beyond the helpless role he had occupied for most of his life and begin defending his father's house. She arrived disguised as Mentes, a family friend, and found the suitors sprawled through the palace as though it already belonged to them. Telemachus alone noticed the stranger waiting at the entrance and welcomed her with the courtesy the other men had forgotten. Speaking as a mortal visitor, rather than revealing what she knew as a goddess, Athena told him she believed Odysseus was still alive, detained somewhere across the sea and resourceful enough to find a way home. She offered no proof. Instead, she told Telemachus that he could not continue waiting for someone else to save his household. He must call an assembly of Ithaca's men, publicly confront the suitors consuming his inheritance, and then sail in search of news, first to Pylos, where old Nestor had returned from Troy, and then to Sparta, where Menelaus and Helen now lived after the war that had cost so much to end. The next morning, Telemachus did what he had never dared to do before. He stood before the assembled men of Ithaca and accused the suitors of destroying his father's estate, demanding that they leave his home and feast at their own expense. Antinous answered with mockery and shifted the blame toward Penelope. Eurymachus followed with smoother evasions, pretending sympathy while offering Telemachus no real help. The assembly gave the young man no protection, but something had already changed. Telemachus had challenged the suitors before the entire island, and they still did not understand that he had stopped simply waiting. He sailed secretly, aided by Athena, to Pylos first. Nestor, aged and full of memory, could tell him little about Odysseus directly, but he described the fractured return of the Greek fleet after Troy, when the leaders quarreled among themselves and scattered across the sea, some never reaching home at all. Telemachus left Pylos knowing that surviving the war had guaranteed no one a safe return. From there, he traveled to Sparta, where Menelaus gave him something more solid. During his own long wanderings, Menelaus had forced the sea god Proteus to reveal what had become of several Greek commanders. Proteus had seen Odysseus alive on an island, weeping in the halls of the nymph Calypso, who held him there against his will because he had neither ship nor crew with which to leave. It was not a rescue, but it was the first reliable proof Telemachus had received that his father still breathed. While his son searched for him, Odysseus remained exactly where Menelaus had described, on Calypso's island, in a place of extraordinary comfort and complete isolation. Calypso had saved his life after his final ship was destroyed, and in the years since, she had grown to love him. She offered him immortality if he would simply stay, forget Ithaca, and become her husband forever. It was, by any reasonable measure, more than most mortal men could ever hope for. Odysseus did not want it. Each day he walked to the shore and looked toward the sea, toward a home he could not reach, and each night he returned to Calypso's cave without joy, mourning a wife and son that a goddess's love could not replace. Zeus finally intervened, sending Hermes, messenger of the gods, to command Calypso to release him. She was furious at the unfairness of it, that gods so often condemned goddesses for loving mortal men while forgiving themselves far worse, but she obeyed. She helped Odysseus build a raft, gave him supplies, and let him go. He was close to freedom, drifting across open water for the first time in years, when Poseidon noticed him. The sea god had never forgiven Odysseus for blinding his son, the Cyclops Polyphemus, and now saw another chance to keep him from safety. Poseidon summoned a storm, violent enough to tear the raft apart and scatter its timbers. The sea goddess Ino, also called Leucothea, gave Odysseus a divine veil that kept him from drowning, while Athena calmed the other winds and drove him toward the land of the Phaeacians. For 2 nights and 2 days he was carried across the waves, swimming and clinging to wreckage, until, on the 3rd day, land finally appeared. He reached the coast of the Phaeacians, naked, starving, and utterly alone, and collapsed beneath a bed of leaves near a river. The next morning, Nausicaa, daughter of the Phaeacian king, came to the shore with her attendants to wash clothing. After they finished, the girls began playing with a ball. Athena caused it to fall into the water, and their startled cries woke Odysseus from hiding. When he emerged, filthy and desperate, the attendants fled in fear. Nausicaa alone stood her ground. She calmed the others and treated the stranger with the dignity owed to anyone who might be under the protection of the gods. She gave him clothing and directions toward the city, but warned that people might gossip if she openly walked beside an unknown man. So she went ahead, while he followed later at a careful distance. At the Phaeacian court, King Alcinous and Queen Arete received him generously, without demanding his name. It was custom among the Phaeacians to help travelers first and ask questions later. During a feast held in his honor, a blind singer performed songs of the Trojan War, and Odysseus, hearing his own past sung aloud by a stranger, wept without meaning to. Alcinous noticed his grief and finally asked who he was, where he came from, and why the story of Troy moved him so deeply. Only then did Odysseus reveal himself. He was one of the Greek commanders whose deeds the singer had just brought back to life. He was Odysseus of Ithaca, and to explain how a king who had left Troy with 12 ships had come to wash ashore without a single vessel or crewman left, he told the Phaeacians everything. He began with Troy's fall behind him and the sea ahead. His first stop was Ismarus, a coastal city of the Cicones, where his men raided the town, killed its defenders, and took its wealth and women. Odysseus ordered them to leave quickly, but the crew remained on the shore, slaughtering livestock and celebrating until the Cicones returned with reinforcements. The counterattack drove the Greeks back to their ships, but not before 6 men from every vessel had been killed. The homeward voyage had barely begun, and already dozens of men who had survived Troy were dead because victory had made the crew slow to recognize when it was time to leave. Storms then drove them toward the land of the Lotus Eaters, a place of dangerous peace rather than teeth and claws. The lotus brought forgetfulness and contentment so complete that anyone who ate it lost all desire to return home, or even carry news back to the ships. The men who tasted it want only to remain there, feeding on the plant and forgetting the lives waiting for them beyond the island. Odysseus dragged them back by force, bound them beneath the benches, and ordered the fleet away before anyone else could taste it. No blood had been spilled, yet Ithaca had nearly been lost from their minds completely. Nothing tested that lesson more than what came next. They landed on the island of the Cyclops, one-eyed giants who lived without laws, without government, and without concern for the customs of hospitality that bound civilized people together. Odysseus, curious rather than cautious, chose to take a small group and explore a massive cave filled with cheese, milk, and livestock, intending to wait for its owner and see what gifts a host might offer, as custom demanded. The owner was Polyphemus, a Cyclops of enormous size and violent temper, son of Poseidon himself. Rather than welcoming his guests, Polyphemus sealed the cave with a boulder no ordinary man could move, and over the following days, he ate several of Odysseus's men, 2 at a time, while the rest could only listen in helpless horror. Odysseus needed a plan that did not depend on strength, because strength alone would fail against a giant who could crush any of them with one hand, and who blocked the only exit with a stone too heavy to shift. He offered Polyphemus wine, strong enough to overwhelm even a creature of his size, and when the giant, pleased with the drink, asked his name, Odysseus told him he was called Nobody. It was a small deception, with an enormous payoff still to come. Once Polyphemus fell into a drunken sleep, Odysseus and his remaining men drove a sharpened, fire-hardened stake into his single eye, blinding him. When Polyphemus screamed for help, calling out that nobody was attacking him, the other Cyclopes on the island heard him shouting that no one was hurting him, and they simply went back to their own homes, assuming nothing was wrong. In the morning, the blinded Polyphemus rolled the boulder aside just enough to let his flock pass through, feeling along their backs so no man could simply walk out disguised as an animal. Odysseus had already accounted for that. He tied his surviving men beneath the bellies of the giant's own rams, and he clung beneath the largest ram himself, letting the blind Cyclops feel only wool along their backs, while the men escaped hidden underneath. It was one of the cleverest deceptions in the entire story, and it should have ended there, quietly, with Odysseus and his remaining crew safely aboard their ship and rowing away. Pride would not let the escape end quietly. As the ship pulled away from shore, Odysseus shouted back to the blinded giant and revealed his true name, his father, and his home. The information gave Polyphemus exactly what he needed. He prayed to Poseidon that Odysseus would never reach Ithaca, or, if fate still allowed him to return, that he would come late, alone, aboard another man's ship, and find suffering waiting inside his own house. Poseidon heard him. The curse did not cause every disaster that followed. Many came from the crew's choices, or the anger of other gods. But Odysseus had turned a successful escape into a personal war with the ruler of the sea. The next stop offered a strange kind of mercy. Aeolus, keeper of the winds, welcomed Odysseus warmly, and as a parting gift, gave him a leather bag containing every dangerous wind except the gentle one needed to carry his ship straight home. For 9 days, that plan worked. Ithaca came into view, close enough to see smoke rising from its hearths. But Odysseus, exhausted after 9 days without rest, finally slept, and his men, suspicious that the bag secretly held treasure he was hiding from them, opened it while he slept. The winds burst free all at once, and the resulting storm blew the entire fleet backward, all the way to Aeolus's island. This time, Aeolus refused to help again, convinced that a man cursed so thoroughly by the gods must be beyond saving. Worse followed at the land of the Laestrygonians, a race of giants far more numerous and coordinated than Polyphemus alone. As Odysseus's ships entered their harbor, the giants hurled boulders down from the cliffs, smashing hull after hull and killing crew after crew, harpooning men from the wreckage like fish. Only Odysseus's own ship, which he had wisely kept anchored outside the main harbor, rather than inside with the rest of the fleet, managed to escape. In a single brutal encounter, he lost nearly his entire expedition. What had begun as a proud return from Troy with a dozen ships was now reduced to 1. It was in this diminished, grieving state that they reached the island of Circe, a powerful sorceress. She welcomed an advance party of Odysseus's men with food and wine, laced with drugs that stripped away their memories and transformed them into pigs, trapped in animal bodies, while their minds remained horribly aware of what they had lost. Only one man escaped to warn Odysseus. Rather than retreating in fear, Odysseus went to confront her himself, protected in advance by an herb given to him by the god Hermes that made him immune to her magic. When his own cup failed to transform him, Circe understood she was facing someone protected by the gods, and switched from hostility to respect. She restored his men, and what followed was not an immediate departure, but a full year of food, rest, and safety on her island, a pause the exhausted survivors accepted more readily than they later admitted. When Odysseus finally insisted that they leave, Circe did not point him toward Ithaca. She told him that before he could go home, he must sail to the far edge of ocean and call up the dead so he could question the prophet Tiresias, the one shade whom Persephone had allowed to retain clear understanding after death. Even before they sailed, the voyage claimed another life. Elpenor, the youngest of the crew, had fallen asleep drunk on the roof of Circe's house. Startled awake by the commotion of departure, he forgot the ladder, stepped from the roof, and broke his neck below. In the confusion, the others sailed without realizing he was missing. Odysseus crossed ocean to the dark land of the Cimmerians, dug a trench, poured offerings, and performed the ritual Circe had described. The dead gathered around the blood, and Elpenor was the first familiar shade to speak, begging Odysseus to return and give his body a proper burial. Tiresias then appeared and delivered the warning that would shape everything still to come. Odysseus and his men would reach the island of Helios, where sacred cattle grazed. If they left the animals unharmed, they might still reach home. If they touched them, the ship and crew would be destroyed, and Odysseus would return late, alone, in another man's vessel, to find trouble inside his house. Among the shades who came forward after Tiresias, one nearly broke Odysseus entirely. His mother, Anticlea, had been alive when he left for Troy, but she told him that grief and longing for her absent son had ended her life. Odysseus tried 3 times to embrace her, and 3 times his arms closed on empty air, because she was now only memory and shadow. He also spoke with fallen companions from Troy, including Agamemnon, who described being murdered after his return through the betrayal of his wife, Clytemnestra, and her lover Aegisthus. The warning was impossible to miss. A man could survive Troy, cross the sea, and still be destroyed at the moment he believed himself safest. Odysseus returned to Circe's island, buried Elpenor with the honors he had requested, and prepared for the dangers Circe now described in detail. First came the Sirens, whose singing lured sailors away from their course and left their bodies decaying along the shore. Odysseus wanted to hear the song without dying for it, so he had his men seal their own ears with wax, while he remained able to listen, bound tightly to the mast. He ordered them not to release him, no matter what he said once the singing began. The Sirens promised knowledge and glory, and Odysseus strained against the ropes and begged to be freed, but his men followed his earlier command and only bound him tighter until the voices faded behind them. Immediately after came a choice with no good outcome. The strait ahead was guarded on one side by Scylla, a 6-headed monster who would snatch and devour 6 men from any ship that passed too close, and on the other by Charybdis, a massive whirlpool capable of swallowing an entire vessel whole. Circe had warned him it was better to lose 6 men to Scylla than to risk the entire ship to Charybdis, and Odysseus, forced into an impossible calculation, steered close enough to Scylla to lose 6 of his remaining crew, watching helplessly as they were seized and killed while he could do nothing to save them. The survivors reached the island of Helios, exhausted, and Tiresias' warning was finally put to the test. Odysseus made every man swear never to touch the sun god's cattle, but contrary winds trapped them there for a full month. Their supplies vanished, and hunger eventually overcame the oath. While Odysseus slept apart from the others, Eurylochus persuaded the crew to slaughter the finest cattle and promise Helios a temple if they ever reached home. Helios demanded punishment from Zeus, threatening to descend into the Underworld and shine among the dead if the living world allowed the crime to go unanswered. Zeus agreed. When the ship finally sailed, his thunderbolt shattered it and killed every man except Odysseus. The wreckage then carried him back toward Charybdis, where he escaped being swallowed only by clinging to a fig tree above the whirlpool, until the remains of his raft rose again from the water. He dropped back onto the timbers and drifted for 9 more days, before washing ashore, utterly alone on Calypso's island. That was where his story to the Phaeacians ended, because that was where his listeners had first heard of him, drifting ashore as the sole survivor of an expedition that had once numbered hundreds of men and a dozen ships. The Phaeacians, moved by his story and honoring their tradition of helping strangers, agreed to carry him the rest of the way home. Their ships moved with supernatural speed and seemed to know their destination without a pilot. Odysseus slept through the voyage and was placed on the shore of Ithaca with the gifts the Phaeacians had given him. Poseidon could no longer prevent the homecoming, so he punished the people who had completed it. As their ship returned, he turned it to stone within sight of its own harbor, fulfilling an old warning that the Phaeacians would one day suffer for carrying travelers safely across the sea against his will. Odysseus woke on the shore of Ithaca, and at first did not recognize his own homeland, since Athena had wrapped the coastline in mist to keep him hidden while she explained what awaited him. 20 years had passed since he had last seen the shore, and his home was no longer safe simply because he had reached it. The palace was occupied by dangerous men. Any premature reunion could get him killed before he ever reclaimed anything, and Athena warned him that arriving as himself, openly, would be a fatal mistake. She disguised him as an aging, ragged beggar, aged his skin, thinned his hair, and sent him first not to his own front door, but to the hut of a loyal swineherd named Eumaeus. Eumaeus did not recognize the disguised king he served, but he welcomed the ragged stranger with genuine generosity, sharing food and shelter, because he believed all strangers and beggars were under Zeus's protection. He spoke with grief and reverence about Odysseus, but years of false reports had hardened him against hope. He wished desperately that his master might still return, yet he no longer believed any traveler who claimed to carry good news. Sitting quietly inside the swineherd's hut, Odysseus heard how deeply his absence had wounded the people who remained loyal to him, and how completely the suitors had consumed what those servants still tried to protect. It was also here that Telemachus, guided safely home by Athena past a suitor's ambush that nearly killed him, first returned to Ithaca and made his way, on Athena's instruction, to the very same hut. Father and son had not seen each other in 20 years, and Telemachus, meeting only a disguised beggar, had no reason yet to suspect the truth. Athena revealed Odysseus' true appearance only once Eumaeus had briefly left them alone, restoring his strength and bearing so suddenly that Telemachus, at first, refused to believe what he was seeing, certain some god was tricking him. Only when Odysseus assured him plainly that this was truly his father and no god in disguise, did the boy finally embrace him, and the two men wept together over years neither of them could get back. Together, they planned how to reclaim the household. Telemachus would return openly to the palace, while Odysseus would follow later, still disguised as a beggar, so he could study the loyalty of the servants and the strength of the suitors before revealing himself. It was a plan built on patience, the same patience that had carried Odysseus across an entire ocean of disasters, now applied to the final and most dangerous stretch of his journey. When Odysseus finally entered his own palace disguised as a wandering beggar, the first creature to recognize him was not a person at all. Argos, his old hunting dog, now aged, neglected, and lying in filth near the doorway, lifted his head, lowered his ears, and wagged his tail when his master passed. After 20 years, he knew Odysseus when no human in the palace did. Odysseus turned away to hide a tear, unable to acknowledge him without endangering the disguise. Argos watched his master enter the house and then died, having survived just long enough to see him return. Inside, the suitors treated the ragged stranger with open cruelty. Antinous, the most aggressive among them, mocked him, refused him food, and eventually threw a stool at him simply for speaking. Eurymachus joined the insults with smoother, more calculated contempt, always careful to appear reasonable to onlookers, while still treating the beggar with casual disdain. Odysseus endured every humiliation without breaking character, gathering information, watching which servants remained loyal and which had grown comfortable serving the men destroying his household. That night, Penelope, who did not yet know the beggar's true identity, asked to speak with him personally, having heard he claimed some knowledge of her husband. She questioned him carefully, testing his knowledge without revealing how desperately she wanted to believe him, and Odysseus, maintaining his disguise even before his own wife, spoke convincingly enough of Odysseus's appearance and travels that Penelope, moved and unsettled, wept for a husband she still did not know stood before her. She told him of her own long struggle, how she had promised the suitors she would choose a husband once she finished weaving a burial shroud for Odysseus's elderly father, Laertes, only to secretly unravel each night's work before dawn, buying herself years of delay before a servant finally betrayed the trick and forced her to finish it. Even now, cornered, she was preparing one final test, a contest involving her husband's great bow, which she would offer to any suitor capable of stringing it and shooting an arrow through a row of axe heads, exactly as Odysseus himself used to do. Before Odysseus left her that night, an old and loyal servant, Eurycleia, was given the task of washing the stranger's feet, and in doing so, her fingers brushed against an old scar on his leg, a wound from a boar hunt decades earlier that she remembered instantly. She recognized him at once, nearly cried out his name in front of the entire household, and Odysseus, gripping her by the throat, begged her silently and urgently to say nothing until the time was right. She obeyed, keeping a secret even as her heart must have ached to share it. The next day, Penelope announced the contest of the bow to the assembled suitors. Whoever could string Odysseus's great bow and shoot an arrow cleanly through 12 aligned axe heads would win her hand. One by one, the suitors tried and failed, unable even to bend the massive bow enough to string it, growing increasingly humiliated in front of each other. Antinous suggested postponing the contest, unwilling to admit that Odysseus's own strength had once made this look easy. It was then that the disguised beggar asked to try, provoking outrage and mockery from the suitors, who considered it an insult that a ragged stranger would even attempt what they themselves had failed to do. Telemachus, in on the plan, insisted his mother's household affairs were his own to manage, and firmly overruled the suitors' objections. Odysseus took up his own bow as though holding an old friend, examined it, strung it with almost insulting ease, and sent an arrow cleanly through the line of axe heads in a single shot. Telemachus moved to his side. Odysseus cast aside his rags, stepped onto the threshold with the bow and quiver, and declared who he was. The beggar's disguise had done its work. Their king was standing in his own hall, and every exit had already been secured. What followed was fast, brutal, and unforgiving. With Telemachus, Eumaeus, and the loyal cowherd Philoetius fighting beside him, Odysseus killed Antinous first, striking him before the suitor understood that the contest had become an execution. Panic spread through the hall as the others discovered that the doors were barred and the weapons had been removed. Eurymachus tried to bargain, blaming Antinous for everything and offering repayment if Odysseus would spare the rest, but Odysseus refused. Every suitor was killed. The bard Phemius and the herald Medon alone were spared after Telemachus testified that they had served the suitors under compulsion. The punishment continued after the battle. Melanthius, who had secretly carried weapons to the suitors, was tortured and killed, while 12 enslaved women, whom Odysseus's household judged to have sided and slept with the intruders, were forced to clean the blood from the hall and then hanged on Telemachus's order. By the time silence returned, the palace had been reclaimed, but nothing about the victory was clean or merciful. Even after the fighting ended, Odysseus was not fully home. Penelope, told that her husband had returned and killed the suitors, came to see him for herself, but she did not run into his arms. 20 years of uncertainty had taught her caution, and she would not surrender to hope simply because a stranger looked and spoke as Odysseus once had. Without warning him, she told Eurycleia to move their marriage bed out of the chamber. Odysseus reacted with real anger and confusion, explaining that the bed could not simply be moved because he had built it around the trunk of a living olive tree, making the rooted tree part of the bed and the room itself. It was a detail known to Penelope, Odysseus, and one trusted servant who had helped guard the chamber, knowledge no impostor could reasonably possess. Only then did Penelope finally break, rushing to embrace him, explaining through tears that she had needed absolute certainty, not blind hope, because too many years of grief had taught her the difference between a comforting lie and the truth she could finally trust. Their reunion, delayed by war, monsters, gods, and 2 decades of separation, was at last complete, built not on appearance, but on knowledge only they shared. Odysseus' homecoming still required one final reunion. He traveled to see his aging father Laertes, who had withdrawn from the palace and lived in grief on a small farm. Even there, Odysseus tested him first, pretending to be a stranger who had once hosted his missing son. Laertes' sorrow finally broke the deception. Odysseus revealed the scar from the boar hunt and named the orchard trees Laertes had given him when he was a boy, the pear trees, apple trees, fig trees, and vines they had counted together. Laertes could no longer doubt him and embraced the son he had believed lost. Peace did not arrive immediately. The relatives of the slain suitors gathered under Eupeithes, the father of Antinous, and marched against Odysseus at Laertes' farm. Zeus and Athena had already agreed that the bloodshed must end, but not before the two sides met in one final clash. Laertes, strengthened by Athena, killed Eupeithes with a spear. Odysseus and Telemachus prepared to press the attack until Athena appeared in the form and voice of Mentor and commanded both sides to stop. When Odysseus moved forward again, Zeus cast a thunderbolt before Athena, and she ordered him to yield. The Ithacans abandoned the feud, peace was sworn, and the cycle of revenge that threatened to consume the island was finally broken. Odysseus' greatest achievement was never simply outlasting a monster or surviving one storm. It was enduring long enough, through pride, loss, temptation, violence, and grief, to reclaim an identity the world had nearly written off as dead. He came home without the men who had sailed with him from Troy, without his ships, and without the years he had lost. He had missed his son growing from an infant into a man capable of standing beside him in battle. His household had nearly been consumed before he returned to defend it, and his victory carried a brutality that could not restore everything the journey had taken. Home, in the end, was never something Odysseus simply arrived at. It was something he had to recognize piece by piece, reclaim from those who had occupied it, and rebuild with the people who had never stopped waiting for him. Thank you for watching this telling of Homer's Odyssey. This story has always meant a lot to me. I first read Homer's epic in school when I was younger, and I later had the chance to watch the classic adaptation. Ever since then, the Odyssey has remained one of my favorite stories. There is something timeless about Odysseus' journey, the monsters he faces, the temptations he must resist, and his determination to return home after everything he has lost. With a new movie bringing this story back to the big screen, I honestly cannot wait to watch it and experience this journey all over again. If you enjoyed traveling from Ithaca's darkest hour to its final peace, consider liking this video and subscribing for more stories from the ancient world. Also, comment below, which part of Odysseus' journey do you think tested him the most? The monsters he fought, the temptations he resisted, or the moment he finally had to prove who he truly was? And if you would like to see the story brought to life on screen, follow the link in the description below to watch the classic 1997 adaptation of the Odyssey for free.